So, good evening, everyone. It's great to finally kick this event off. There's been much planning and anticipation over the past couple of weeks, so we're really pleased to get to the evening. Now, contrary to what WebEx is saying, I'm unfortunately not the Energy Institute. My name is Jim Reichs, and I'm Vice Chair of Events for the Energy Institute Young Professionals Network, London branch. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm sure you'll all become accustomed to us using the acronym EIYPN. Now, day to day, I work for Scottish Power Renewables. After graduating from the UEA in 2019 with a Master's in Energy Engineering, I shortly after joined the Graduate Development Programme here in London. So I've just started my second year there, and it's been great, and I'm really excited to see where that takes me. Now, alongside me today, I couldn't have brought this event here today without some help, so I'm going to drop them in it and ask them to show their face. Aitana, Francesca, Alicia, and Anthony were all key members in bringing the event together this evening. So a huge thank you to them. Now, attached to the joining instructions that you were emailed, and I trust that all went okay, we attached an introductory one-pager to the YPN, who we are, what we do, and some of the plans for this upcoming year. Now, if you didn't receive that, do let us know, and we can ping that across to you. And I'm sure my colleagues will be in the chat with any questions if you have them. So this is the first of many events this year, and fortunately for me, surrounded by an inspirational bunch who behind the scenes have been hard at work, and we've got a host of other great events, socials, as well as trainings planned for the upcoming year, and we're ready to launch those when guidance allows. Now, one we are really excited for is YPN Connect. It's a speed networking event, and that's been in the planning for a while now. But we do want to run this one face-to-face, so we're just holding it sort of in the background for the moment. And, you know, whilst I recognise doing a face-to-face event might be quite some time from now, I think it's all important for us to stay positive. And as a committee, it's one we're really excited about, and it'll give us the first proper chance to share our network with you all properly. So please do stay tuned, follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, as well as joining our mailing list. You know, we update regularly, weekly on there, so it'll be great to have you guys join us. And we'll be in touch soon with more information. So having a look here, I mean, it's brilliant. We've just got just over 80 participants who have joined us this evening, and that's a mixture of students, young energy professionals, as well as experienced energy professionals. So thank you all for being here this evening. Now, after the speakers have discussed wind and the power of policy, we'll have a Q&A session, and that will be led by Aitana, our new committee member this year. So please, throughout the event, use the Q&A tab, which you'll see bottom right. Send in your questions, send us in your thoughts, any anecdotes of the day, whatever it may be. Please do try and engage with us, and let's make the most out of the next hour and a half or so. So, welcome to the inaugural event of this year's event roster. We are pleased to have such a great turnout. And I'm really pleased to have secured such a stellar panel for you all. And I'm sure we'll all be able to take away some nuggets of wisdom from them. So thank you all for being here this evening. Now, for the wind industry, the current economic, political, and even social climate is quite a mixing pot. It's changing rapidly. But yeah, we've got all the right experts with us today to help make some sense of it. So they'll discuss how effective finance, policy, as well as regulation can help define the decisions that are needed to be taken to achieve net zero by 2050. And I think we can all agree that on as well as offshore, and should probably mention floating wind as well, will be a key part in achieving that. For me personally, it's brilliant to have Jonathan join us, and hopefully he can give some insights into Boris's recent announcement and what that means in practical terms for our industry. And green financing, well, that's becoming more and more pertinent So Marina and Elizabeth, thanks ever so much for joining us and sharing with us your wealth of experience. And Huub, in your role as Director of Energy, Minerals and Infrastructure for the Crown Estate, as well as sitting on the Board of Directors for ORE Catapult, I'm sure you'll bring an exciting alternative perspective to the discussion. So, and for all the participants, we hope you benefit from our speakers' knowledge today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Marina, and she'll give us some insight into the opportunities of this green, wind-driven economy ahead of us.
Thank you, Tim. Hope everybody can hear me. Thank you very much for having me today. Thank you, everybody, for joining and listening. My name is Marina Valls. I'm Chief Economist at RenewableUK. RenewableUK is the trade association representing the renewable sector in the UK. So ultimately, what we do is work with a wide range of members who all have interests and activities in the renewable sector, understand their problems and barriers they may face in their market, and support them to support the implementation of the right policy framework that will allow them to continue to thrive in our country. So I'm very happy with the title of the event today, Power of Policy, because that's ultimately what we do every day. So I'm very pleased with that. Prior to that, I was working in the gas sector, and so moved on to wind and renewables about 4 years ago in my career now. I'm starting this, so probably should set a bit the scene before the other speakers can talk a bit more in detail about what they do. I think in general, 2020 has been obviously a very strange year for everybody, but it definitely, when we think about renewables, marks the end of an amazing decade of growth for the renewable sector. We've built on a lot of the public commitments and the Paris commitments, the Paris Agreement commitments, and exceeded almost all predictions and expectations that were sort of set on the sector. I think it's quite interesting to. I tend to be a bit of an optimist, let's say, but it's very interesting when you look at if you go back and look at some forecasts from the IEA about 10 years ago. It's quite interesting to look at the new forecasts now on renewables and the share that they think they're going to have in 2030, in the next 10 years, in 20 years. So we're clearly in a sort of quite interesting phase, I'd say, for renewables. I think what has allowed this, and we'll get on to that during the conversation tonight, is obviously the right policies that have sort of enabled people to get confidence and to send the right signals around investing in renewables. But at the same time, the amazing success story of wind, mainly obviously in Northern Europe, but also all over the world. And the idea that now we no longer have a Conservative Prime Minister talking about how much renewables cost. We're talking about how every household in the UK is going to be powered by wind in 2030. And we're no longer talking about reaching the carbon budget, but we're talking about net zero by 2050. And that acceleration and that sort of positivity and thinking, this idea that we can do it and we can do it even faster, has definitely come from the amazing advancement in technology and cost reduction that we've observed in the wind sector. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to do on my side as an introduction. I'm sure we'll go more detail around what policies later.
Thank you, Marina. I'll hand over to Elizabeth, and she can delve a little bit more into the financing side of wind energy.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jim, Francesca, and to all of you Energy Institute young professionals. It's a pleasure to be with you and talking about wind this evening. I'll explain a little bit about who I am and what angle or perspective I'm coming to this topic from. So I am an energy banker at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. EBRD is an international financial institution owned by governments around the world, and we are active in Central Europe to Central Asia and parts of North Africa and the Middle East. I work particularly at the moment in Greece, Poland, and between the two a bit in the Balkans. We are counter-cyclical. Our goal is to catalyze private capital. Anything the commercial banks would finance, they should, but we want to help encourage them and bring them in and fill in any gaps when they're hesitant about taking risks. We can finance across the capital spectrum. We do majority debt. And I, on the energy team, do the financing of electricity generation, distribution, and transmission. A lot of onshore wind project finance lending. So that's a bit about my perspective and where I'm coming from. I think we can maybe dig more specifically into wind project financings. I would say for now, the exciting thing that's happening in the wind financing sector is the move away from dependent on government subsidy. It's really encouraging for our goals of decarbonization that more and more projects can be built on a merchant basis. So that's something I'm excited about.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Now, before I hand over to Jonathan, just a quick heads up to everyone. If you do see any polls that pop up on the screen, please engage with us by answering and don't be alarmed to the speakers if something pops up. So I'll hand over to Jonathan and he can maybe give some insight into the state of the industry and a response to Boris's recent announcement.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim, and hello everyone. It's great to be here. It's great to be here from the comfort of my own home, but there are certain events that you really want to attend in person, and I think an Energy Institute Young Professional Network event sounds like quite good fun, and I wish this was one we could have attended in person. But anyway, we'll make do with the circumstances we're in. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about this, the state of the industry, and start just by talking about the news that we've seen over the past couple of weeks with the announcements about the vision and appetite of our current government in the UK for growing the renewable energy sector. So the announcement the Prime Minister made was that by 2030, every home in the UK would be powered entirely by wind energy. And as part of that announcement, he mentioned a target of 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and investments in ports and a whole load of other things that would support that grand vision. And that is a remarkable position for the renewable energy industry to find itself in. Almost as surprising, I suppose, is the fact that in the news the following day, even the Daily Mail had a headline that was almost positive about the future of wind energy. And that just shows you how far we've come. So I don't know how many of you are working in the renewable sector or how many of you have followed the renewable sector, but you've probably seen that we haven't always been universally supported in certain sections of the media, the Daily Mail in particular. And although we've always known that we were doing the right thing for the right reasons, it hasn't always felt like that because we've been told so often in the public domain that what we're doing is unreliable and unaffordable and a waste of time. So it's quite amazing that we've got where we've got to. But you shouldn't always believe what you read because actually those headlines have always been completely misleading. RUK, in fact, did a poll a few years ago where 75% of the people polled were very positive about renewable energy. But when asked whether they thought they would be in the in the majority or minority, 75% said they thought they would be in the minority. So that shows you the support has always been there, but the negative commentators seem to be making more noise than the positive ones. So public opinion is turning. You could say that's because of the great work that that companies like Scottish Power and organisations like the Crown Estate are doing. But probably there's a Scandinavian schoolgirl who's had just as much to do with changing public opinion than any of these big companies, because the Greta Thunberg effect has really helped to change public opinion. And as a father of young daughters, I know how effective it is when a schoolgirl tells you what a disappointment you are. So I'm not surprised that that's having such an impact. But actually, it's no accident at all that we are where we are today. We've earned this position in this industry. We've always believed in ourselves. We've always believed in our technology. We've always believed in the cause. And it's because of that belief and the fact that we've delivered on practically every promise we've made that you will see a Prime Minister make such a grand statement. I sometimes liken the history of renewable energy to the great quote from Mahatma Gandhi talking about the political struggle. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And that's really the history of wind energy, particularly in the UK, because at the start, when it was small onshore projects, just a niche idea, we were very easy to ignore. And then as the projects got bigger and we went offshore, people started to laugh and said, that'll never work, that can never power the economy. And then as we got bigger still and we started to really become part of the mainstream, people fought against us and said that this is unaffordable and this is unreliable. And we proved them wrong, and we proved we can deploy at scale, and we proved that we can deliver reliable electricity. And we became the cheapest form of electricity in the market. And so now we are winning. And so we've won our right to those kinds of grand political announcements. And that's a wonderful place to be. So what does that mean for our market? So today, the renewable energy sector in the UK, and probably Marina knows this far better than me, is more or less about 13 gigawatts of onshore, 13 gigawatts of solar, and about 10 gigawatts of offshore wind. And by 2030, that needs to become 25 gigawatts of onshore wind, so we're more or less doubling the size of that sector, 30 gigawatts of solar, so again more or less doubling, and 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, so multiplying by 4 more or less. So that's an enormous task that we all have to face up to, but it's also an enormous opportunity, especially for you guys who've joined us tonight, who will have huge opportunities to work in one of the most exciting sectors at an incredibly exciting time, doing something hugely, hugely important. So policy has always been really important to our industry. The industry grew in the first place because of a policy framework that incentivized investment, that made it possible to get the planning permissions and the grid connections. And really offshore wind boomed in the UK because of the policy framework. We set out the most ambitious targets for offshore wind of any country in the world, and we put in place one of the most stable frameworks to allow people to develop and then build projects. And that's why the UK is the most prominent sector still today globally. But you can contrast that with onshore wind. When the policy support dried up in 2015, the industry ground to a halt, and about 30% of the jobs in the industry were lost overnight. So policy is massively important. So political words are wonderful. Daily Mail headlines, I must say, make me feel slightly uncomfortable. I always preferred to be an enemy of the Daily Mail. Anyway, it really, none of that matters. What really matters is action and putting the right policy frameworks in place and actually getting on and doing this. Because on the matter of climate change, the time for talking is past. Now is the time for action. And if I can use the words of Greta Thunberg, we need to act like the house is on fire, because it is.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that great overview. And I'll hand over quickly to Huub for a roundup and an overview of the wind industry now, and maybe some of your insights for the future.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And thank you, Jonathan, for that strapline. The time for talking is over, just as I was going to speak. So forgive me to speak a little bit about that burning house, and maybe just by way of introduction and seeing that this is a young professional event, I couldn't agree more with Jonathan wanting to be there in personal. So I drink my German, in this case, glass of water behind the screen, sitting at home. It's not quite the same as socializing, is it, guys? So my own journey in this is I was actually trained as an astrophysicist, and out of curiosity for business, joined Shell as a geophysicist at the time of the great technological expansion around 3D seismic, and then found myself sucked into strategy work and was one of the people who in the late 90s set up an organization that at the time was called Shell Wind Energy. And we created Shell's first wind energy business, and I had the great pleasure of being the project lead for the first 2 offshore turbines ever constructed in the North Sea at a beautiful place called Blyth in Northumberland, which is in the northeast of the country, where the wind always blows as you don't want it. So construction was very difficult. During the financial crisis, when Shell concentrated on its, at that time, core business, I left Shell, stayed with wind energy. Shell got out of wind energy at that time, and I joined the Crown Estate, who is the entity that in the UK it owns the seabed and it manages access to the seabed. It's quite a unique UK construct, and as an organization, we operate as an independent commercial organization, and we have an ability to create value by interacting with the commercial market. We operate in a commercial way, and the revenue that we make from our business, we surrender to the Treasury in its entirety. So we are an organization that works for the benefit of the country. Now, one of the bits that we do very much is we are driven by a desire to make sure that the seabed is used for the benefit of the nation. And when I think about offshore wind, the biggest challenge that I see in front of us is that 2050 horizon. So we know what we need to do. We know the world that we need to design for. It's a world where Greta has told us that our current house is on fire, so we need to make sure that we douse the flames and that we build a resilient house, one that will stand for centuries. We also know that we need to do that in a way that is respectful to the environment around us. We are also having a biological existential crisis, and 1 in 7 species in the UK is threatened with extinction, not just a bit less of, but extinction. So the fact that people rebel on extinction is something that is not lost on us. And therefore, with offshore wind, we have a technology that we believe works in a fantastic way. It works by creating energy with components that are benign to manufacture and install, and that when they are installed in the right way, and when the design on those wind farms is being done in the right way, can actually help to also maintain and enhance that biodiversity that is so critically important for us. So, as Crown Estate, one of the ways that we do that is by running leasing rounds, and at the moment we're in the market with what we call leasing round 4, and we can talk a little bit about that if there's interest. What I believe the greatest opportunity is also for a young energy audience is that this is a market that will expand over decades to come. So, and if I would just put a number to that, even the expansion out till 2030 will see about £50 billion invested in new offshore wind farms. Presumably this can all be done in harmony with that natural environment. Well, that's £50 billion over the next 10 years. And that market, it can arguably double again in the years up till 2050, because we know there are some pretty big numbers like 75 or 80 gigawatts of offshore wind that we wish to install in the UK. So a huge growing market, which we believe can be done in a responsible and respectful manner. And if I contrast that with another infrastructure project that sometimes hits the press, High Speed 2, the cost of High Speed 2 is around £100 billion overall, even though the official number is a little bit lower. The leaked numbers are around the £100 billion mark. So offshore wind is a business that over the next, shall we say, 20, 30 years or so, is a business of the same scale as the biggest infrastructure project that we have in the country. So it's a tremendous opportunity for people with every different skill set so that we can build that resilient and safe and environmentally balanced house of the future that we all would like to live in. Jim, back to you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Huub, and all the speakers for giving us an introduction to your sectors. So, Elizabeth, I want to just come back to you, and maybe Marina, you can also chip in on this. You were saying that it looks as though subsidies might not be the way forward for financing. And Jonathan, Marina, you touched on the speed of transition and how quickly we are growing the installed capacity of offshore and onshore wind. And due to that speed, what sort of financial support would there be for wind energy, and what are the opportunities for financing?
So I'll put it a bit into historical context that the early wind support was often a feed-in tariff where the government would pay you your full revenues at a fixed price. And the more competitive policy support that has followed the feed-in tariff is the feed-in premium or contract for difference, where you bid in a competitive auction to win at a strike price, and then the public counterpart pays you the gap. But you sell your electricity on the wholesale market, and then if you sell it at a price below your CFD strike price, then the public counterpart pays you just that difference. So good to have competition to allow taxpayers to pay less when the costs are coming down of the technology, and good that that there's less of an outlay to be paid by the taxpayer. And the next phase that we're in already, though it's overlapping with the CFDs, is alternatives, including offtake, selling your electricity to a commercial counterpart. So that might be directly to one large electricity user like Google, Amazon, Nike, or that could be signing a power purchase agreement with an intermediary who signs those power purchase agreements, PPAs, with both the commercial end consumer of the electricity and with the electricity generator. And in this alternative bucket, there's also having no clue what price you're going to be selling your power for over the life of your power plant. So selling it on a fully merchant basis. So that's sort of the evolution of the offtakes, which are often shaped by policy support. From a lender's perspective, and from an equity owner's perspective also, knowing what revenue you'll have, what price you'll sell your electricity for, is more appealing usually, and lenders would leverage the project much higher if there's fixed price offtake. More and more lenders, including EBRD, are willing to lend to merchant wind farms, for example, where there's the volatility and uncertainty around what power price will be achieved, but with lower leverage and sometimes shorter tenors also.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Marina, is there anything else on that front from you?
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Elizabeth. I don't know if you noticed, but I lost the connection for a little bit, so
I did.
probably lost the beginning of your response, Elizabeth. So I don't know if I would repeat it. I would repeat what's already been said. But yeah, I think so. What we've observed so far is that the reassurance, sort of that visibility over a certain sort of 15-year period that is offered by a financial mechanism like the CFD has allowed a lot of investors who probably would not have been keen to invest in the first place or to lend to sort of renewable projects in the first place to get in the market and now understand it very well. So now it's a procurement mechanism which is really well understood and quite simple in a way that sort of has allowed a lot of the cost reductions that we observe because you reduce the cost of capital in a way because you have that visibility on what you're going to get. So that is definitely something that has helped a lot the sector. And I think while it's true that we're seeing different projects looking at different options and with prices probably going down every time, you need to start looking at other alternatives to make up sort of for that revenue. So you'll have different types of assets and different types of project owners that will look at different ways to fund their project. With maybe a bit of a riskier, a bigger risk appetite in some cases than others. But overall, we're observing that longer contracts are the ones that sort of keep those low prices in check because you obviously have less of that risk to bear for yourself. So yeah, that's what we're seeing, and I'd say that's definitely what we saw in the UK, and we're seeing that other countries have obviously used the CFD mechanism as well and are implementing it now, while other countries are moving away from it. So there are different types of instruments that you can play with to offer that reassurance to both developers bearing the risk and lenders on the other side, reducing the cost of capital. But yeah, overall, you will need that sort of visibility in what you're investing, especially when we're talking about the big level of deployment that we're looking at to meet net zero.
Perfect, thank you. Jonathan, I want to come to you. You know, in order to become more competitive, driving down costs is always going to be useful. For you, what sort of innovations or potential barriers are there at the moment in order to unlock that next level of energy transition, and how can the industry drive down costs to make financing, alternative financing, more promising?
Sure, I think that there's probably three things that are going to drive the cost trajectory. But probably if you ask me about what's the area of innovation that really matters to the future of our sector, it's not actually about cost at all. Well, and I'll come back to that. So the three things that drive cost, one is the size and efficiency of the wind turbine generator. And what you see is over the past 10 years in offshore wind, we've moved from 2 megawatt wind turbines to we're now at probably about 14 megawatt wind turbines. So that size has made a huge difference to the efficiency, the wind capture, the amount of electricity generated, and had a really significant impact across the whole cost spectrum. The second thing is cost of capital. As much as we like to
Is that me, or has Jonathan lost connection for you?
I think he's having some technical difficulties.
No problem. I'm sure he'll connect again. We'll move on to Huub. Maybe Huub can either continue on that train of thought, or if not, Huub, I did want to.
So so Jonathan was talking about the three principal barriers to further growth, wasn't he? And I think one of them that he was talking about was cost, and clearly cost will remain a big issue. Just as a number, and this is not a highly accurate number, but I like order of magnitude, having been trained as an astrophysicist. If you're a factor of 2 out, then that's good enough if you want to know the mass of the sun. Well, the value of the transmission network that we already have offshore is about half of the cost of the transmission network on land. So already the cost of the hardware in the sea for connecting wind farms up to the grid starts to look pretty much like the cost of all the overhead cables that we have on land. So a huge amount of hardware going in, and cost reduction on that hardware will remain critically important as the technology moves into new areas. And for example, larger wind turbines, what Jonathan was talking about, will be absolutely critical to continue that cost reduction journey. And there are new technologies. There was a question about floating wind that I will leave others to speak to, but floating wind has got fantastic potential, but it needs to find its cost reduction trajectory because at the moment it's still very, very expensive. And then we have the human factor. So sending people out to maintain wind turbines that are 100 or 150 kilometers offshore and sending a crew of people into a little cabin that itself is 150 meters above the waves to work on highly complex mechanical machinery is a very great responsibility for operators, and making sure that we engineer these environments to be safe for the men and women operating them is an absolute challenge to all of us. And then we haven't even spoken about the environmental dimension, which I believe in the end is going to be the main factor that will allow us to continue expanding. We need to be able to design these huge systems in such a way that they do not do any harm to our natural environment. I see that Jonathan is back, so back to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much for filling in for me, Huub. I appreciate it. Sorry about that, my connection failed me. So I guess, I was saying that there are three big things. One is the turbine technology, which has been one of the main drivers to date. The second thing is how we actually operate wind farms, using data much better, using diagnostics in order to really optimize the way in which we operate and maintain these assets offshore is going to be a huge value lever in future. The holy grail being that we are having such advanced data and diagnostics that we can predict a maintenance issue months before it occurs and therefore only maintain when it's needed and not according to a time-based schedule that may not be very efficient. And the third big thing I think Huub was talking about, which is the cost of the transmission network. But that's actually the one that's important to us, not just because of cost, because one of the most relevant things for our sector that we have to face up to is that wind is a variable resource. It's not the wind is not constantly blowing. Now, of course, the wider you develop your network of interconnected wind projects, the less variability you have because the wind is always blowing somewhere. And there are other ways in which you can manage demand to try to mitigate the impact of wind being variable. But one of the most significant areas of innovation and technology development we need is storage. At the moment, there's only 4 gigawatts of storage in the UK, and most of that's pump hydro. We're probably going to need probably 5 times that amount of storage in the future, and probably none of it will be new pump hydro. It's going to have to come from batteries and other things. So there's a huge technology revolution that has to occur in the storage area in order to really allow us to fully fulfill our purpose.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, before we move on to the Q&A section, and we'll also ask everyone to involve with the polls that come up after this. But on the topic of storage, I suppose it was a question for Huub as well. Looking into hybrid projects, what are the opportunities for a majority fixed bottom project that may have additional floating, and is there a future for implementing solar, hydrogen, or battery into that? And then from Marina and Elizabeth's side, how will the financing play into that, or does it not matter what the project looks like for financing?
I think the question on the hybrid projects, so the the combination of technologies is really a very important one, because in the end, the bit that is limited is the amount of space that we have available. So making sure that we maximize the efficiency of use of space is critically important. And hybrid projects can be energy generation and food production. So they can be energy production and in various forms. So the energy can be produced as electricity, or it can be run through an electrolyzer. You can create hydrogen, or you can create ammonia, and you can create fertilizer. And then, so all these technologies, there is a huge amount of innovation happening. There's a lot of discussion on the hydrogen economy as well as a carrier. And to Jonathan's point on storage, the ability to convert large amounts of surplus electricity when the wind blows really hard into hydrogen and store hydrogen, or enrich existing gas networks with hydrogen, are fantastic ways of making sure that we reduce the carbon content of our energy in a controlled manner. And therefore, there will be innovation across a whole range of technologies will be critically required for years and years to come.
Thank you. And yeah, I'll let you. You're about to say something, Elizabeth.
Jim, you asked, does the financing matter? Definitely, yes, very much. Often we're paying the majority of the cost to build the project. So, yes, and I agree that particularly I think when we think about how can we finance storage more and more when revenues can be less certain, et cetera. And it's all about the revenue stacking of how many different sources of revenues can we get for those projects, and what certainty can we get around those revenues. A hybrid project really helps because you can have the revenues from the electricity generation in a more stable way from the renewable energy component to combine with the storage, which is still very expensive.
Indeed, indeed. Has any of the other speakers got any other comments on that?
Well, actually, just to make one comment, Elizabeth said the financing is very important. I think we in the industry kind of often take a lot of credit for cost reduction because of technology, but I think it's fair to say, Elizabeth, that the cost of the capital has influenced the cost reduction just as much as the technology has in the past 10 years. So financial innovation and financial liquidity has been essential to our success.
Brilliant. Thank you. Now, before we move to Q&A, we did have some polls prepared. So to give you guys a breather as well, we'll put those on screen now. Yeah, feel free to put those live, and hopefully everyone can give us your thoughts and give us some insights into who's with us today.
We're all anxiously watching the B votes.
Yeah. Thanks, Fran. Will they stay live, Fran? I think they will.
I mean, the one thing I would say, Jonathan, is that the free drinks is not on there.
Good one.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, I did see we've got a whole host of questions that have come in. And T will lead this section. But any questions we don't get to, we will feed these back to the speakers, and we'll publish these on our LinkedIn. So do follow us on there, and we'll keep up to date.
Thank you. And thank you all the speakers for that amazing discussion. We do have quite a few questions. Some of them are quite similar, given that the attendees can't look at each other's questions. We're going to go into different topics. The first one I wanted to touch on is wind intermittency. There's quite a few questions about it. what would be the impact on the market, also how to support wind but also get more inertia in the grid, and overall how can policies help the challenge of intermittency. I think probably, Jonathan, you touched on this in your previous discussion, so maybe you could answer some part of this question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, not wanting to repeat, but let me just quickly go over what I said a minute ago and sort of turn that to answer the question. So yeah, I mean, it's a matter of fact that wind is a variable resource, and if you want wind to be the backbone of your electricity sector, you have to find a way to address that. I think there's three main ways in which that can be done, and the technology for all of these already exists. So one is interconnection, more interconnection between projects, more interconnection between countries, creating the biggest network you can. And then that way you really smooth out those peaks and troughs, because the wind will be blowing somewhere for sure. It's very rare indeed that you have prolonged periods of no wind, across a whole continent. The second thing is demand management. An awful lot of electricity consumption happens at times that it doesn't actually have to happen. And so if you can somehow shift that demand to times which are more convenient to the electricity system, then you can, again, do a huge amount of smoothing out of peaks and troughs. Not so easy in the domestic setting because consumer habits are a bit harder to change. But industrially, there's a lot of industrial consumption that could be moved to more convenient times. And the third thing is storage. And right now, we have lithium ion, we have chemical storage options that simply need investment in order to get them to the point where they are scalable, reliable and capable of delivering what we need. So the technology is there. Actually, what we need is a policy framework that incentivizes the investment in order to deliver the technology and allows people to monetize that investment. And today, getting an interconnection project going is very difficult. It takes a long, long time. Storage, again, it's the policy framework around monetizing storage is still quite underdeveloped, and demand management is still very much in its infancy. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, to set the right framework out, and then we'll get on with it. The investment community are probably quite hungry for these types of investments, and we'll make it happen.
Amazing, thank you so much.
Could I just add one comment to what Jonathan said, which is there is, and I completely agree with all these points, there is a fourth one, and that is geographic spread. So the UK is a very large collection of islands, and the wind to the west is often a bit different from the wind to the east, from the wind to the south and to the north. So if we are able to ensure that our wind farms are spread geographically, it will also help to ensure a more predictable flow of power into the grid. It's actually one of the reasons why in our current leasing round 4, we have pre-selected areas both to the west as to the east of the country. So that is partially done with a view on ensuring that more balanced development of capacity.
That's great. I also think that probably answers one of the questions related to regions and policy, which is amazing. And touching on what Jonathan mentioned, and from now having been Scottish Power for a month, I can answer one of these questions myself actually about hydrogen storage and offshore wind developers using this as a potential way of storing and a viable opportunity. It is something that they're looking forward. But in terms of hydrogen, and now that I have you on my screen, Huub, that you mentioned, what are the key challenges and policy changes that need to be realized so that these opportunities become interesting and financially available?
Well, that is a very broad question, and one of the big challenges is that hydrogen is the conversion sequence is still quite high cost, and therefore there's really a market that needs to be made. And for those of you who are interested, there is a pretty authoritative report that was issued by Catapult, the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, who have done a lot of work looking at the technology to create a hydrogen system as part of a system with a very high penetration of wind power, and that has got some fantastic perspectives. But it is a very deep question with a very deep answer.
Yes, of course, and we only have so many minutes here. Changing a bit the subject, and just from previous conversations that we've had, I wanted to ask Marina if she has any thoughts about the policy requirements to ensure that there is a large enough skilled workforce to enable future targets to be reached, as I know she is very happy for young people to join the industry.
And Tana, could you just repeat quickly the question? I'm sorry, my connection is a bit rubbish, but I'll answer.
Policy requirements to ensure that there is a large enough skilled workforce to enable future targets to be reached.
Yeah, that's a sort of also quite broad question. So I think there are lots of initiatives that are currently in place. If you look at the Offshore Wind Industry Council and the sector deal and the different sort of targets that they've set for themselves to ensure that there are enough, you identify the areas where you're going to need some skills in the future, the areas where people will retire, the areas where new technologies will create new jobs. So all that is something that is looked at in order to sort of try to assess where and when those skills will be needed, and how to make sure that when we do need them, we have people who are sort of ready for them, so who've undergone the apprenticeships or the programs that needed to be in the right place. So that is something that people are starting to look at. But I think personally, I do not think you get to that level. I mean, if you're talking to sort of a young audience here today, I do not think you can get to those levels without promoting the sector, really. So it's all about the work that you guys are doing here, ultimately, making sure that people understand and know about the opportunities that the renewable energy sector has to offer to young professionals. But also sort of when you're choosing your career path also at a younger stage. And I think, there's a lot of promotion around that needs to happen, and that is happening within the industry.
And maybe leading on to that, and I know about Elizabeth's amazing work with women in engineering. Could you add anything on that?
On encouraging young people to go into renewables. Well, I think we work in a very special field because we can take such sense of purpose and pride from our work. I think it's a wonderful thing to be doing our bit to aid with decarbonization and addressing climate change. So I hope that that purpose will come across to those considering entering the sector. And I think I can speak maybe for all the panelists that we're happy to speak with young people and help in any way we can. And we have an EBRD jobs site you can look for, and let me know if you have questions or if I can help. And yes, I have the pleasure of doing some mentorship and care very much about supporting others. So let us know how we can help.
Amazing, thank you so much. There's also quite a few questions about floating offshore wind. One of them says, how many years do the panelists expect for floating offshore wind to become economically viable at a commercial scale? Would you know, Elizabeth? Do you have any ideas, any guesses?
We could do a poll. A few more years is my guess. It's still very expensive, but I think, what do you all think? 2 to 3 years?
I think that's optimistic, Elizabeth. Sorry. Let me say something about that, if you don't mind. Hopefully my connection will get better. I was telling you earlier on about disappointing a schoolgirl, so I've just had to throw my daughters off Netflix in order to try and stabilise the connection a bit, okay? So this is the sacrifice I'm making to be here. So I think floating has enormous potential. And there are some markets where fixed foundation offshore wind just aren't viable because the water's too deep. And there are some markets, including the UK, who want to take the sector of offshore wind so large that they will run out of fixed foundation options. And so floating is going to become a critical part of the journey to 2050 net zero. The thing about floating is the structures are absolutely enormous and they cost a lot of money to initially design and to set up the fabrication. But the other good thing about the structures is they are quite prone to standardization and repeatability. So the same structure can more or less be used with different turbine types in different sites. That's very different to fixed, which are more bespoke. So what you need is massive scale deployment, and then you will see the costs come down significantly. And once you get that addressed, floating has two advantages over fixed. One is it's further from shore, traditionally, capturing more wind, producing more power. And the other is its installability is actually a lot less because you're not drilling into the seabed and jacking up expensive crane vessels, etc., etc. So absolutely you have to see the economic indicators are it will get there. I think, Elizabeth, more like the end of this decade. I think by the end of this decade we'll see kind of half gigawatt to gigawatt size floating projects happening, and that's going to be really starting the journey then of rapid cost reduction down to the point where it will be competing with fixed.
Jonathan, it depends on geographies, right? There's some like Greece where the seabed is so deep that they might deploy more floating or move more to that technology rather than the traditional offshore.
Exactly, and so there's a number of markets that have to probably go floating because fixed just isn't an option. But what you need a market that's got probably right now only the option for floating, and it needs to have large scale, and it needs to have reasonably high power prices. That's what's going to get the market set on fire. So if you want me to gamble with you, California is where I think you're going to see floating really switch on. And who wouldn't want to work in California? So there you go. One to think about when you're planning your career choices.
And in terms of any wind industry, which market do you think could be the next one to boom? We have a question relating to Asia, Scandinavia, the US, and many more. Obviously, you mentioned California for floating, but is there any other opportunities? Do you see anywhere?
Is that to anyone in particular?
To yourself, Jonathan.
Oh, to me, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I think that in terms of high growth markets, Europe is going to continue to be a massive growth market. There's going to be 450 gigawatts of offshore wind in Europe by 2050. So it's going to be absolutely enormous. The USA is going to be a huge growth market. Already we're starting to see massive momentum gathering in the US, particularly in the Northeast. And I think that, how quickly that happens may depend on, the kind of political situation, but it's going to be huge in the US. And then I think there are some markets in South America like Brazil that have colossal potential. But really, the boom markets for renewables in general are in Asia. So in Asia is probably going to install twice as much renewable energy than the rest of the world between now and 2050. So look to Asia if you want to see growth.
Perfect. Thank you so much. There's a couple more questions about skills and talent within the industry. And given that we have the young professionals here, I would like to just delve a bit more into them. Catherine asks, how important is attracting talent from oil and gas to meet the skills requirements? Huub, do you mind answering that?
Well, thank you. And given the fact that I myself moved from oil and gas into renewables, what I would say is it is really important. I believe when you come from an oil and gas background, what you bring is an understanding of complex projects. And that's actually a blessing, but it's also a little bit of something that you may want to let go of, because oil and gas works with very high risk, high hazardous projects. So if you've worked on a platform offshore, on a gas production platform, the risks there means that the engineering is carried out to a very different level of, shall we say, detail than on relatively more straightforward structures like large offshore wind turbines. So there is and offshore wind projects inherently also are a bit more simple. They are more repetitive, of relatively simple installations. So when you come from oil and gas, you bring a hugely valuable skill set. What you need to realize is that you need to hone that down, and you need to just shape it so that you are fit for a very competitive offshore wind industry. So it's a blessing, and it's a piece of homework.
Amazing, thank you. You touched on health and safety and risk within the oil and gas sector, but there was a question regarding health and safety within renewables. It says, is health and safety performance on an organizational level a consideration for renewable investors? I'm guessing this would be more directed to the finance panelists, but either Elizabeth or Marina, if you want to answer that question.
I've been very impressed, by the way, by how switched on the questions are. I was going through, and you all really understand what's happening and how it's about grid capacity for absorbing the variability of renewables, etc. Health and safety, yes, really matters, and is something that we as a lender not only look at, but we make the sponsor commit to covenants around health and safety and in general environmental matters, including bird monitoring, etc. So I feel comfortable that, at least from my perspective, it isn't forgotten.
Amazing. And now that we're moving into the last section of this Q&A, I just wanted to ask, and this is also interesting for myself, how do you think young professionals in wind can best influence policymaking now for maximum impact in 2050? How can we get a seat at the policymaking table? And this is open to all our panelists, of course.
Anyone going to go first? Marina is maybe the best qualified to answer.
Protest? No, I mean, yeah, protest, why not? But I think that's what's interesting about the sector, is that it's so new. And when you look at the average of, I don't know if it's the median age of workers in offshore wind, it's much younger than in all the traditional energy sectors. So I think people who work in renewables tend to be obviously younger, but also passionate about what they're doing, and with a sort of a greater ambition that that your work, the idea that your work is greater than you and that you can accomplish things. And it's, in that sense, I think now is a great time to move into that sector, because if you ask questions, if you organize events like the ones that you are organizing, or and I would second what Elizabeth said, the Q&A shows how aware and how sort of really interested people are, the people who are attending in the audience. So I think if you keep asking these questions at events, but also to your management, to sort of your colleagues, you are making the conversation move forward. So you are participating in conversation, because we are creating these new markets. But ultimately, any conversation makes it go a bit sort of beyond what it was even a few months ago. I remember working in the gas sector, and even though I really loved my job there, it was sort of already established. So any conversation that I could have was something about a regulation that had been passed years and years and years ago, and was hard to change, whereas now we have all these views, all these assessments and consultations that are happening every day in the renewable sector, and the government is asking the industry, is trying to listen to the industry and asking them, how can we do this better? How can we make sure that we meet our targets? So there's definitely a lot of conversation happening, and I think if you ask your questions, if you show interest within your colleagues and management, you will hear about it and see it moving and be involved in it from a very, very early stage in your career. I probably should say that I'm not that old as well. So I feel like I'm very much in that stage still in my career where I'm asking the questions and happy to see things moving when I'm asking them, and starting to understand a little bit how we can make things move forward. And we are witnessing it as we speak. So it's very exciting and very interesting.
I would add that within my area of the financing, if you work for an IFI, international financial institution owned by government, instead of for a commercial bank, your shareholders are governments, and you have a voice and a role and regular meetings with ministers of energy in setting up the energy policy and advocating for what you think best practices should be, etc. So if the policy side is particularly interesting to you, you can think about things like IFIs as potential employers.
So can I have a go as well then? So I mean, I think that you know, the generation, if you like, of people we're talking about, and I'm really disappointed I'm maybe not in that generation anymore. But you have an enormous opportunity to be the ones that actually create the consumer pool, the electoral pool that really drags our society away from being a carbon-based economy into being a clean one. People in mine and Huub's generation, and I'm also quite surprised I'm saying I'm in Huub's generation now as well, we always fought with the economics and the politics of this, because the economics weren't clear because what we were doing looked expensive, and the politics were messy because too many people simply didn't believe that we had to do what we have to do. The economics are now obvious. This is the cheapest way to produce electricity, and the economic damage of doing nothing is simply unconscionable. And the politics are getting clearer because people now see, especially on the back of something like the COVID pandemic, that an external event can totally disrupt your way of life, and therefore you need to protect your society. So the conditions are right now for change, and you have the ability to make the change, and the change comes from consumer pull. Regulatory push only gets you so far. You know, if you look at how did we move from horse-drawn transport to motorised, it wasn't a clever Victorian regulator trying to remove horse shit from the streets of London, which is something they still be struggling with today. It was because that's what customers wanted. That's how we moved from landline telephony to mobile telephony in, you know, a tenth of the time that people thought. Regulators tried to slow it down, and they simply couldn't because the consumer demanded it. So yours is the generation which is better connected than any previous generation, which is more aware of the need to act, and which now has all the tools in front of you because the economics and the technology is clear. So be the ones that create the consumer pool, organise yourselves and demand change, and change will surely happen.
So, Jonathan, I could not agree more. Yeah, I could not agree more. It is consumers that make the change. And so there are three things you can do. It is to buy renewable electricity. And there are many, many really good suppliers out there. Buy renewable electricity. Write to your MP when you're based in the UK. Write to your MP because they do read your letters and they do respond to your letters. And the third one is speak to your friends, and it's better to share an electric vehicle than to own a fossil fuel powered vehicle. It's consumer power.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I think we're near the end of the Q&A session. I wanted to say thank you for all our panelists joining us today and giving up their time to just share the knowledge. Also, thank you to the amazing people in the team at the Energy Institute, YPN, for helping us organize all of this. And now back to you, Jim.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to finish on. But just firstly, we started with over 90 participants and we've still got just 90 participants. So it's good that people have stuck around and it seems like they enjoyed the conversation. So thank you to the speakers. And Marina, what you were saying earlier about knowledge of the industry, sharing your experiences of the industry, promoting what's happening in the industry through especially sort of careers and early skills, into universities. That's a sentiment that us, the YPN, are taking forward this year and really trying to promote. So we've also got an event planned for next September, but it's already in the works because we want to put together a real, big skills for the future event is what we're calling it, and also to touch and take the idea of diversity and inclusion and the wide-ranging people that are required for the industry to succeed. So for us, that's nice to hear as well that the speakers agree. And I did say at the start, and T, you said it as well, the group that we've got in this committee is brilliant. And, all we want to do is grow, develop, and share our experiences with a network of future energy leaders. So thank you, everyone, for joining. And we hope you join our network, become a member. The best way to stay in touch is through our LinkedIn, Instagram, or our mailing list. And we look forward to welcoming you to all of our future events in the coming months. But for now, have a great evening, everyone. Take care, stay safe, and we'll all be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.